Hello everybody and welcome to this course on Band 9 model answers for writing task 1 of the academic module of IELTS. So we're going to be looking in this course at a wide range of tasks for writing task 1, looking at charts and tables and graphs and maps and processes. And we're dividing all of these out across 6 sections. So looking at graphs with a trend, comparative graphs, 2 or more graphs, graphs with a future element, processes, and then maps. And in each of the sections there will be 3 tasks to look at. And we're going to start by looking at graphs with a trend. So the way that we're going to run these lectures is that we're going to look at the task to begin with, we're going to try and plan our response, and then we're going to try and write the actual response paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. So let's have a look at this one here. This is our first task. The graph below shows the quantities of goods transported in the UK between 1972 and 2000 by 4 different modes of transport. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Now that part of the task, that second sentence, that always remains the same no matter what task you're looking at. So you're going to get used to seeing that quite a lot. But we want to focus specifically here on that first sentence. The graph shows the quantities of goods. Now, the first thing we want to do when it comes to building a plan is we need to identify the type of task that we're in. And the type of task that we're in can be identified by looking at the axes. So here, along the x-axis, you can see we have a range of dates. And on the y-axis, we have something different. In this case, it is millions of tons of goods transported. But the main thing here is that if we have dates running along the bottom here, then we know that we're dealing with a graph with a trend because we're looking at how data changes over a time period. That doesn't necessarily need to be a line graph like this. It might be a bar chart as long as there are different dates. It could even be a pie chart. So sometimes you have multiple pie charts, 2 or 3 pie charts, and in each of the pie charts you have a different date. Again, you can consider trends when you see those. And we need to keep this in mind because it will influence the language that we use when we write our response. We're going to use trend language. Increases, decreases, rises, falls, climbs, slips, grows, tumbles, etc. There are quite a few different words and phrases you could use here. Don't forget you can use your adverbs as well. Significantly, considerably, slightly, consistently. All of this language is featured, by the way, in the Theory Task 1 academic course. And if you haven't taken that course yet, I strongly recommend that you go through that course either before you take this course or as an accompaniment to this course. I talked about that in the promotional video. It's still relevant. It's very important that you're able to see how this works on a theory level as well as on a practical level. So we have a graph with a trend here, and now that we have identified that, we need to write that down. We can just head up the plan with that language. And when it comes to planning the actual paragraphs themselves, we really only want to plan 3 of the paragraphs. Again, this is all talked about in the Task 1 theory course, but we just want to plan the overview, which typically will be the second paragraph. Some people like to look at it as a conclusion or a summary as the last paragraph. I think it's better in the second paragraph position. So the overview, and then a 3rd paragraph and a 4th paragraph, and the 3rd and 4th paragraphs are going to focus on the details, whereas the overview will look at the graph in a very general way. You'll see that one paragraph is missing, that is the introduction. But we should not need to plan the introduction. We should be able to rely on templates and on our own knowledge and vocabulary and grammar to get us through that often 1-sentence paragraph. So we need to plan the overview. And when we plan an overview, we should think about the data and how we can describe it in a very general way. So what you absolutely shouldn't do here is include any specific figures. So you don't want to talk about how in 1980 pipeline distribution was at almost 20 million tons. Nothing like that. Instead, what you want to focus on here are either comparative elements or overall trend elements. So when I talk about overall trend elements, you could sort of mention how while A and B go up, C and D go down. No specific figures, but just generally reporting the directions that each of the categories go in. Now, when it comes to graphs of the trend, it can actually be more useful to consider the comparative elements, because you need to have at least one comparison within the actual response itself, ideally a couple more, because of course we have that instruction, make comparisons where relevant. So when I think of comparative elements, I'm more thinking of using superlative language, like the most or the least of something. And when it comes to graphs with a trend, you can identify these features by simply looking at those lines and where they appear. So for instance, you see this blue line. It carries along the top here, and it refers to the road transportation, which means that road carried the most goods, or at least the highest weight in terms of goods. So that's the most of something, whereas the least of something will be the bottom line, and that is pipeline. And this task may be a little bit easier because those two lines, they remain the same. They remain in their respective positions throughout. So road always stays on top, pipeline always stays at the bottom. But of course, if a lot of the time they will cross over, the positions will change, that's absolutely fine. You might use a sentence like, while at the beginning of the period, road was the most popular form of transportation, while pipeline was the least popular. By the end of the period, maybe these positions had reversed, or maybe water had overtaken rail to become the most popular, whatever it is. But there you're looking at positions. You're not looking at specific data points, just positions, and using those positions to create some comparisons. So that's another opportunity there. In this particular overview, let's consider those top and bottom lines. So we have road at the top there. So road, and I'm just going to use the symbols here plus just to mean most. We'll consider the actual language, the vocabulary later, but remember with the plan you want to move out of it as quickly as possible. And so naturally pipeline will get two minus symbols just to emphasize that it is on the bottom. Now when it comes to P3 and P4, the ideal with detail paragraphs is that we create a clear theme. We present a clear central topic, to use band descriptor language, a clear central topic within each of the detail paragraphs. Now, in this particular task, as there are 4 categories, I think it makes sense to talk about 2 of the categories in one paragraph and 2 of the categories in another paragraph. But even within that separation, you can still create another theme. For example, you might combine water and rail because they start at a very similar point. That could be the reason that you combine those together. And then road and pipeline you combine together because you mentioned them in the overview, and also because they are in the highest and lowest positions. But you might also go on a more thematic level. For example, if you were looking at a task and the task was looking at different sports, and 2 of the sports involved a ball, like football and basketball, and 2 of them didn't, like running and swimming, then you might look at running and swimming together and football and basketball together. But the main thing is that you have a clear central topic within each of those paragraphs. There's a clear theme there, and that you make it very clear at the beginning of the paragraph what that theme is. That's why we open with cohesive devices like focusing on A and B, then later with regard to C and D. And then that's very clear to the reader what's happening. In this particular task, I recommend that we do what I just mentioned that we do, which is focus on water and rail to begin with, because they start in the same or very, very similar place, and they are second and third throughout. Yes, they swap over, but they don't become first and last. Whereas road and rail can come in the final paragraph. Sorry, road and pipeline, I meant to say. And just to save a bit of time in your plan as well, you can just use the first letters, of course. So instead of W and instead of water and rail, we can use W and R, and instead of road and pipeline, we can use R and P. Now, of course, road and rail, they begin with the same letter, so we may need to just add a little bit more here. So in P3, I should really be writing RA, and then in P4, I should be writing RO to refer to road. Great. That's our plan. That's all we need. Don't worry too much about how you're going to construct those detailed paragraphs. We'll come to that later, but essentially we're just going to move from beginning to end. So there's no real need to structure those paragraphs. So let's move into the introduction here. Now, when it comes to an introduction, again, if you've taken the Task 1 theory course, you should have some ideas here, but essentially we can rely on a few templates. The first thing is that we just want to try and paraphrase. So let's go with the graph. Here you have shows. There are plenty of different verbs you could use here. Demonstrates, reveals, highlights, illustrates. I'm just going to go with demonstrates here, but you should never be short on verbs here. Demonstrates. Now, we have the quantities of goods. So when you have the number of, the amount of, the quantity of, you can always paraphrase this to how much or how many. Remember, how much is for uncountable nouns and how many is for countable nouns. Now I'm going to use how many because I want to focus on the actual unit of measurement. The unit of measurement is sometimes not included in the task language itself, but it does appear in the graph. So you have it down the axes and you have it in the title of the graph. Oh no, you don't even have it in the title of the graph. You literally just have it in the axis here. So we can use it though. We can say how many tons of goods. It's a nice way of paraphrasing. Now when you use how much, how many, you do not use a relative pronoun. You do not use which. You say the number of tons of goods which were, or how many tons of goods were. And then you move to the transported. So we will, should we use the same word here? Yes, I think we will. Transported does have synonyms, but they are not always perfect. We will use them later, but in this introduction, I want to convey the introduction with absolute accuracy. So I will use the same verb here, transported. How many tons of goods were transported in the UK? You may want to change the sentence structure around to improve a bit of paraphrasing there. How many tons of goods in the UK were transported maybe, but I think this is okay. In the UK by, so we'll move the between 1972 and 2000 to the end, but here we'll just look at the by and then we'll paraphrase this part here. By, for, they've got different modes of transport. We will go with for separate forms of transport. And you can easily paraphrase between and with from and to. From 1972 to 2000. One thing that I haven't mentioned, it's just occurred to me, we haven't highlighted any of the key words here. If you find that practice useful, I often recommend it with task 2. If you find that practice useful, then absolutely go ahead and do that. However, I find that for the vast majority of tasks, it's very clear what they want from you. All they're trying to do is describe the graph for you rather than give you instruction. The instruction really is the same every time. Summarize the information, selecting and reporting the main features. But if there are any parts of the task that you think you might struggle to remember as you go through it and you think they're important, then definitely highlight those keywords. That might come up once or twice in this course, but on the whole, I don't find highlighting the keywords useful enough for it to justify the time it takes in task 1. Task 2 different, but task 1 not so much. Okay, now that's the introduction done. Let's just read that out to get a good idea of it. The graph demonstrates how many tons of goods were transported in the UK by 4 separate forms of transport from 1972 to 2000. Nice and fluent. Let's move into the overview. Now, an overview should really begin with either an overall or an in general. It's up to you. We'll go with an overall. Overall, always a comma in that position, overall. And then it's nice to introduce the overview with a bit of introductory language, if you like. So that can be what stands out from the graph is that, or it is clear from the graph that, or even just it is clear that. So let's use that. It is clear that, okay, now we look to our plan. We have road plus plus. We want to talk about road being the highest in this chart. What language could we use here? Well, certainly we want to use a superlative. I keep using the superlative highest, so it's certainly going to come in useful. Let's just write it down. The highest. Now we have to consider what we are measuring. We are measuring goods transported in the UK, but we're not measuring the number of goods. We're measuring the weight of goods. We're measuring it by ton. And the nice thing about the word ton is you can actually turn it into a noun that refers to overall weight. And that word is tonnage. Tonnage. So it wouldn't make sense to say the highest tons. You'd have to say the most tons. But you can say the highest tonnage. So the highest tonnage of goods was, now notice the tense here. You should have seen this also in the introduction as well. But typically, when we're looking at a graph with a trend, and it looks at 2 times in the past, so 1972 to 2000, for the vast majority of the task, sometimes throughout the task, you just want the past simple. Whether that's past simple active or passive, that depends on the context of the sentence, but it will almost always be past simple. So was transported, or okay, now maybe let's change the verb. Now we have that transported originally. Let's go with the verb. Okay, there's a good one beginning with D, distributed. So it was distributed by, and you can see from the plan, road. And it's nice, particularly in an overview, just to stress that we're talking generally and we're covering the whole graph. We can just add during the period. Or you can say throughout the period. That's also okay. But you might have to use both, and I think we will here. Because now we need to talk about pipeline, which also covers the whole period. Now, it is on the other end of the scale to road, so it's opposite. So consider a cohesive device that we could use here. I'm going to use conversely, and then another comma. So conversely, and we'll switch the order of the sentence around now. So we used road quite late in the sentence. We'll use the category first this time. So pipeline was the... Okay, so you could turn distribute into a noun and say distribution. Maybe it's a little bit too close though to the verb. Another one you could use is conveyance. And of course I can't say the conveyance, but what I'm trying to do here is say the conveyance form. That doesn't sound quite right. The conveyance type doesn't sound quite right. The conveyance method would be useful here. So the conveyance method, now here we can use a relative clause. It was the conveyance method that, the conveyance method which. So this is a defining relative clause where you can use which or that, but I always recommend using which because which is never wrong unless you're describing a person. But which is appropriate for defining and non-defining relative clauses, whereas that is only appropriate for defining relative clauses. So which, okay, transported, distributed. Let's go with another one beginning with C, but a bit simpler. We can use carry. And of course we're in the past here, so carried. Pipeline was the conveyance method which carried the, and what's the opposite of highest? It is, of course, lowest. I don't want to repeat tonnage, but we can simply say weight. And we don't need to say weight of goods because we know now that that is what is being measured. So the lowest weight, and earlier I mentioned the other word we could say instead of during, which was, what was it? It was throughout. So let's have a look at this again. Overall, it is clear that the highest tonnage of goods was distributed by road during the period. Conversely, pipeline was the conveyance method which carried the lowest weight throughout. You could, if you wanted to, turn that into a complex sentence using whereas. As this is the first lecture, I'm not going to go quite that far at least in the overview. We may come to that in the detailed paragraphs.